This is episode 446 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined by Brian Domitrovic. He is with the Laffer Center, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, but it's Laffer Center. And he has written a new book, Taxes Have Consequences, alongside Dr. Arthur Laffer. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Brian.
Oh, thanks. It's really great to be here.
Yeah. So before we get into the book and the themes of the book, talk a little bit about both the Laffer Center itself and I assume he's your boss, or at least the namesake of the organization, which kind of makes him the boss in general. But Arthur Laffer has a long history in American economic and tax policy, and his name is associated with a famous curve, and you can describe whatever details you want from there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm at the Laffer Center in Nashville, Tennessee, and that is the educational institute that Arthur Laffer started some years ago. And it's a 501c3, a tax-deductible organization, like we probably will talk a lot about today. It's a big element in our recent book on tax history, that general form of business or organization. And Arthur Laffer is one of the most important economists of modern history. Kind of obviously, he was the person who, from academic economics, really spearheaded the tax revolts of the 1970s and 1980s. He was an essential advisor to Jack Kemp and Ronald Reagan. It was Jack Kemp's tax cut that formed the basis of the great Reagan tax cuts of the 1980s. One economist who won the Nobel Prize, Robert Shiller, estimated that the popularity of the Laffer Curve in the media, when it first came out, that's the relationship between tax rates and tax revenues in the 70s, rivaled that of the Rubik's Cube, which was an enormously popular toy at the exact same time. He found out that people talked about the Laffer Curve as much as they talked about the Rubik's Cube, which just blows away any other kind of economic curve or something from academic economics. So yeah, Arthur Laffer's had this just tremendous influence. I won the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Donald Trump. And in fact, former President Trump wrote the preface to the foreword to our book that just came out last week, Taxes Have Consequences.
Yeah. Now, can you briefly describe the actual Laffer curve and what it implies for tax policy?
Yeah. The Laffer curve is something that Arthur Laffer came up with in the early 1970s. It's an economics curve, so it has two axes, and the one axis going up and down has tax rates, TR, on the side, tax rate singular, and on the axis going across, it has tax revenues, and then it's kind of a bulbous curve. So the curve starts out low at zero tax rates and tax revenues, and then as tax rates go up, the curve goes out, so higher and higher tax revenues, and then as tax rates go up further, the curve turns around. And so by the time you get to 100% tax rates, then the revenue is zero. So somewhere in the middle is an optimal point where a tax rate yields the maximum amount of revenue.
Right. And very simple stuff. I mean, nobody's going to work when they're taking 100% of your earnings, but no money will come into the government if you're not taxing it at all. So the question is whereabouts in the middle, and thus most political and economic debates over tax policy over the last, not just since the curve, but certainly the curve has played a role since then. And in your book, Taxes Have Consequences, can you offer kind of the overarching theme of the book to us in terms of what kind of consequences, and specifically you're talking about the income tax of the United States?
Yeah, so our book, there are three co-authors, Arthur Laffer, me, Brian Domitrovic, and Gene Sinkfield. And the book is titled Taxes Have Consequences. The subtitle is An Income Tax History of the United States. So what we've done is we've looked at the history of the income tax. And so the income tax was started by constitutional amendment and then statute in 1913, 109 years ago. So since 1913, we have had an extremely extensive history with the income tax. So what we wanted to do in this book is to write that tax history, and in particular in view of its effect on the economy. And if I might say there's a thesis to the book, now it is a narrative history, but if there isn't, if we just chronicle the effect of the income tax on the economy since 1913, if there is an argumentative thesis to the book, it is that when tax rates are high, the top earners, because it's a progressive income tax rate, shelter their income like crazy, and Congress lets them do it. And the result is economic bad times for everyone else because the rich aren't deploying their money in real economic purposes. But when tax rates are low, the rich earn their money freely, don't shelter it. Everyone does really great, and the rich basically pick up the whole nation's tax bill. So I'd say that's the thesis of the book.
And talk about the income tax when it was instituted way back in 1913. It was a pretty narrow tax only on very high earners.
Yeah, the point of the income tax at first in 1913, so it passed by the arduous process of constitutional amendment finally in February of 1913, getting 3/4 of the states, 38 states out of the requirement then. Just as Arizona, I guess there were 48 states at that point, 36 states, it was 3/4. So then Congress passed a statute in October of that year, signed by Wilson, and the original point of the income tax was simply to replace the tariff. The tariff had carried the load of the federal revenue system for all of American history up to that point. People were sick of it. And so the same statute in October 1913 that lowered the tariff introduced the income tax. And the rates were modest. There were just 7 rates, 1%, 2%, up to 7%. And the income threshold was high, about $75,000 in today's earnings. So if you made $1 million, you only paid 7% at the top. And if you made $100,000 in today's money, you only paid 1% at the top. So comparatively speaking, it was quite modest. I mean, even below the employer contribution for the employee contribution for Social Security and Medicare today for anybody.
Yeah, it's as bad as that original tax was. It was mostly just the camel's nose under the tent of widespread income taxation. So, taxation has consequences. Talk about how we've gone and evolved since then, broadly speaking, and what those consequences have been along the way. Any highlights or lowlights of a tax policy. I'm sure the Great Depression probably is one that you spent considerable time on, but just run a brief tax history of the United States.
Sure. Yeah, well, right away, the income tax got out of control. So, you had this modest system that was replacing part of the tariff. First couple of years, small rates on high incomes, and that's it. By 1917, just 4 years later, the rate was already up above 60%. And then in 1918, 5 years later, it was up over 70%, top rate of 77%. So what happened, all of a sudden up 11-fold. And it stayed high there up until 1921 at 73%. And so, whoa, this is because of World War I in theory. But the tremendous depression came over the economy. This is the first time people really started talking about calculating 2 statistics, the inflation rate of the Consumer Price Index, which was invented in 1919 because prices had more than doubled. And then also the unemployment rate. It arguably went all the way up near 20% in the recession of 1920-21. And nobody had any idea what was going on. And the government kind of figured it out early on, is that the rich people were shielding their income from taxation. In particular, their favorite way of doing it, there are lots of ways at that point, is that they were plowing money into municipal bonds, because in the first statute, municipal bonds, the debt issues of state and local governments were free from taxation in their interest payments. So the rich just took all their money out of the economy and put it into municipal bonds and these other tax shelters, because the rates all of a sudden were 77%. And, we're in a huge recession. So then there were these big tax cuts at the top in the 1920s to get the money out of the shelters and into the real economy. And sure enough, you had the booming, roaring 1920s. But then they changed all that in 1930 to 32. They jacked up the tariff again, contrary to the 1913 precedent. And they added a huge increase in the income tax effective January 1932, taking the top rate to 63% again. And so the rich just said, forget about it. I mean, pulled their money out of the economy. We had all the bank failures, the 25% unemployment, the great privation of the Great Depression, an event that lasted the whole while because FDR built on Hoover's precedent and raised income taxes even more. Just the rich sheltered their income like crazy. The Treasury Secretary Morgenthau had no idea how to stop it, and he told Congress that the rich are sheltering their income. I can't do anything about it. And it's only when you had tax cuts in the 1940s and then the 1960s that you started to see the kind of American dream style life that the nation thought of as its birthright. And so those stories are the stuff of our book. It's a narrative history of the income tax and its devastating effect on the economy when those rates are high, and its much more moderate effect on the economy when the rates are low and private business can really get going.
Yeah, and it's something that obviously we've seen in recent years where tax rates have been at somewhat low levels relative to history, but the debt has continued to grow and grow and grow, and all of this is contingent upon just printing money, and obviously that's not necessarily directly involved in your book. But what we all know about Ronald Reagan, and of course he was, and I'd love to hear more about how he was influenced by Arthur Laffer and his approach. But of course, John F. Kennedy had a very Lafferite approach, or Laffer-esque, maybe the way to say it. But Kennedy is underrated as a tax cutter. So talk about some of those people between the Depression and Reagan, and how they positively or negatively impacted the tax situation in this country.
Sure. The first president, kind of post-war president, Harry Truman, he did sign a tax cut right as the war ended in November 1945, and that was very important. Took the top rate down over 10 points right out of World War II. But the key thing that Truman supervised was the radical reduction in federal spending. Federal spending was something like 45% of GDP in 1944, and by 1946 it was down to 11. So you just had a 3/4 reduction in federal spending, and man, did the economy love that. And then in 1948, 47-48, Truman vetoed 3 tax rate cuts in a row, a big one. It was effectively lowered the top rate by 30%. And finally, Congress overrode his veto in April 1948. And that the Revenue Act of 1948, the tax cut of 1948, is one of the most important in American history. It was an effective tax rate cut at the top, especially highest incomes of about 30%. So that's really where post-war prosperity got going, with the double tax cuts of 1945-48, coupled with the incredible decline of government spending. You saw that surge of growth in the private sector out of World War II. 1950s growth was mediocre. I mean, there were 4 recessions from 1949 to 1960, four in 11 years, because Truman and Eisenhower jacked up the top rate to 91%. And Eisenhower made a mistake in not cutting that tax rate. That's clear. Richard Nixon lost the election to Kennedy in 1960 because there were simply too many recessions. They were happening too frequently. And Kennedy made it very clear that he wanted to get this country moving again. And there was a tremendous debate and discussion throughout Congress throughout the 1950s that tax rate should be lower. There should not be a marginal rate of 91%. There was a national consensus on this. I mean, the Democratic head of the House Committee on Ways and Means, Wilbur Mills, couldn't have been clearer on this throughout the decade. And so John F. Kennedy just built on that precedent. And he said, we're going to cut tax rates by 30% across the board. And he got that done. And you had double the rate of economic growth in the 1960s at 5% than you had under Eisenhower of 2.5. So, when presidents or when tax rate cuts happened, the economy succeeded, and when they didn't, the economy failed.
Yeah, and of course Reagan. I think it's safe to say that, maybe with the exception of President Trump, and I definitely want to talk about what Trump did as well, but how did Reagan change the trajectory of tax policy in the United States, and would you call that taking a page of Arthur Laffer's playbook, or were there things that he did that weren't maybe as spot on as you would have liked?
Yeah, well, the immediate context of the Reagan presidency, I mean, the reason Ronald Reagan ran for president is because the 70s were so pathetic economically. So Kennedy cut tax rates in 1963, 64. And there was this incredible boom in the economy. Then Lyndon Johnson raised tax rates a couple of years later, his income tax surcharge, and Richard Nixon kept that going two ways, raising the capital gains rate and also taking the dollar off gold, which caused inflation. The American tax code had never been indexed for inflation. So with inflation, real tax rates went up. So you just had a carnival of powerful tax increases in the late 1960s and the 1970s. So there was this incredible economic sluggishness for a dozen years before Reagan took office in 1981. And it was characterized by that high inflation, often double digits. We're talking about inflation today of 8.5%. Man, there were 5 years in this period when it was over 10% a year. I mean, the price level increase tripled from the 60s through the early 80s. I mean, you had 3 times as much money to keep ahead, except if you did that, you kept going into a higher tax bracket and getting your money taken away. So you had to earn more than 3 times the increase in prices. Of course, no business is going to give raises to their workforce more than equal to 3 times their revenue growth. So it was a structural war conducted by the state against the economy. And you had the economy shrinking, recessions in the context of double-digit inflation. That's why Reagan ran for office in 1980. And he said, advised very much by Arthur Laffer. Laffer had gotten to know him beginning in 1975, was meeting with him socially constantly and in an advisory capacity for those 5 years. And Reagan has accepted the Jack Kemp bill in Congress, which had Laffer's fingerprints all over it, which was we're going to imitate the Kennedy tax cut and have a rate cut across the board, 30%. And that largely happened by 1983. And you had the incredible takeoff for 18 years.
Yeah. Now, you talked about spending, and I'm a big tax cut guy, but I'm also a big spending reduction guy. And obviously, unless we just are going to go into interminable debt, which seems to be the case now because we're all modern monetary theorists at this point, the spending situation is something that needs to be addressed. Now, how would you describe Reagan's spending and how that affected his tax policies?
Yeah, so federal spending stayed pretty high in the Reagan years. It crested, I believe, around 23 or 24% of GDP, and then went down in the second half of the presidency. And then, of course, went quite a bit down in the 1990s, down to 17, 16% of GDP. And that's when the United States started running budget surpluses. So we know that the secret to not having a deficit is to lower government spending. Now, there were a number of reasons spending was high initially in the Reagan years. And the first one was Reagan wanted a military buildup, which he got, and that was instrumental in ending the Cold War, of course. The second reason is that Congress didn't believe inflation was going to end. They thought inflation they thought the tax cuts were inflationary. So when Ronald Reagan had his program of tax cuts, they budgeted for inflation. Well, we're going to have 10% inflation every year. You're not going to solve it. Nobody else has. Well, he did solve it. And so when you had a 3% inflation in 1983, 84, 85, Congress is still spending as if there was going to be a 10% inflation. So you had this big difference between the federal budget's anticipation of inflation when inflation actually was. So that was an incredible real increase in federal spending. Then I would say the third reason there was large federal spending in this period is because it was so easy to finance. So even though the United States started running $200 billion budget deficits under Reagan, probably triple the peak of the Carter era of anything seen in peacetime before, more than that, they were a piece of cake to finance because everyone wanted to buy American bonds once inflation went down and the United States was super productive as an economy. Yeah, we want the debt instruments of that country. So interest rates just collapsed under Reagan. From very high levels in 1980. So I would say there are all these factors making spending very easy. But the thing is, once you really got an economy rolling, once you had 40 million new jobs from 1982 to 2000, stock market up 15-fold from 1982 to 2000, nobody wants to be part of the government game anymore. Nobody wants government contracts. Nobody wants to work for the government because the private sector is so exciting. And so people just quit the government. You saw government spending go down to 16% by the end of the 1990s and 4 years of surplus. So Reagan showed us completely how to vanquish the spending problem. That is to have spectacular private sector performance, and you will in due time run into surpluses.
And it seems to me that President Trump tried to follow that same model, if you will, the Reagan model, because Trump, alas, did not crack down on spending. And in fact, it grew even further. And that, obviously COVID had something to do with that. And we could debate that. And that's probably book-worthy material by itself, fully analyzing the Trump administration's response to the COVID pandemic. But in general, it did seem that the Trump tax cuts were highly effective, even if spending grew dramatically as well.
Yeah, we're really happy that President Trump wrote that forward to the book, because he did a really great job. Just this, it's a couple pages distilling what he did in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This is a great piece of legislation, and its economic record was utterly unblemished and spectacular. So from 2017 through 2019 through early 2020, I mean, the effects of the Trump tax cut were simply wonderful. Finally had 3% growth, 2.93% growth, after not seeing that number at all since the early W administration. And median family income skyrocketed. African-American unemployment and the poverty rate collapsed to absolute historic lows. So corporate revenues into all levels of government went up 9 years into a business cycle. That had never happened before. So the separation of growth from the United States from the Eurozone and from economic competitors, that was very unusual. So this is a very successful economic performance in 2018, 2019, and early 2020, putting the nation clearly on the road to what we had seen in the early 1980s, which is if you keep doing that kind of stuff, you're going to have budget surplus real fast. And you're going to get the likes of Alan Greenspan in 2001 saying, hey, we're going to run out of federal debt. We're paying it off so fast. And then the Federal Reserve won't be able to make open market operations. Literally, that's where we were 20 years ago. And that's the road we were on as of February 2020. And then all the spending started. So I think if we want to look at the Trump administration, the lessons on how to get out of our current problems, just do what he did in 2017, 2018, 2019, first 2 months of 2020, and we will have all our problems solved by 2040.
So that would be obviously Biden. It's going to fall on some deaf ears, but you're talking about whoever is the next president of the United States could certainly follow that basic policy prescription and finally cut inflation and get the economy back into something resembling a growth trajectory.
Yeah, the normal course of the American economy is to produce the American dream, where money holds its value. There's tremendous opportunity. Tons of people do well, even inadvertently, even if they aren't that great at working or have skills. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the American economy produces a lot of fortunes and a lot of opportunity and just sweeps all sorts of people along when it's in its super growth mode. And that's the natural mode of the American economy. This stuff about high inflation, unemployment, recession, secular stagnation, that's alien to the American experience. So if we have it now, it's unnatural. If you just clear out the unnatural stuff, it's gonna be great.
So I want to ask a few more systemic questions here. Like nowadays, you don't get Congress passing ambitious tax legislation. At least it hasn't happened in a while. What we've been looking at is these reconciliation bills, which are 10-year bills. That adds a level of uncertainty and complexity. Is that a big problem, do you think, for tax policymakers? Obviously, both sides of the aisle are so divergent in their views on basic economic policy. It doesn't seem like Democrats are willing to reduce taxes, and Republicans won't go along with a lot of what the Democrats want to do. But 10-year reconciliation bills isn't the way to do policy either. So how big of a problem is that?
Yeah, I might be comfortable saying that the 10-year sunset is responsible for the slow growth of the 2000s, of this millennium. So the biggest problem with the 2000s compared to the previous period and the long term of American economic history, we've had very slow growth, really 2% or sub 2% growth from 2001 on, even before the Great Recession. And I might be comfortable laying the entirety of the blame on that unbelievable secular stagnation, un-American secular stagnation, on the 10-year sunset. Because it was the first time that was notably applied was in the Bush tax cut, the W tax cut of 2001. That tax cut had to be sunsetted after 10 years. Well, as Robert Bartley said at the time, the editor of the Wall Street Journal, a tax cut has to be three things. It has to be permanent, marginal, and immediate. He realized people weren't getting the message in Washington, the Bush White House, and he had to repeat it. Permanent, marginal, and immediate. Got that? Not permanent, huh? Well, if it's not permanent, it's not going to work. And it was not marginal, and here were all these, sub top rate tax cuts in the Bush tax bills, and it wasn't, it wasn't immediate. It was phased in. Well, then the investors are just going to stay on the sidelines, and they can pull their money out 2 years before the expiration. What was 2 years before the expiration? 2008. So yeah, I'd be pretty comfortable in saying that these reconciliation sunset provisions are about 100% responsible for our horrible economy for the last 22 years.
And what about states and just broadly speaking, good tax policy? Is it? I know, and I'd like to talk to you about this in a second. Someday, getting rid of the federal income tax. I don't know how realistic you think that is, but at the state level, certainly a lot of states are making moves towards reducing or even eliminating income taxes. Arizona, I believe, just went with a statewide flat tax 2.25, and you have 9 states that don't tax income at all. Is that the move that you would advocate? And while I know it probably is, what would you say are the real impacts or the notable things that are benefited by that?
Yeah, we really live in two countries. What the old commission said, well, with 2 countries, one black, one white. Well, we live in 2 countries right now. We live in zero income tax states and income tax states. The zero income tax states, I hope you can hear me now because I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee is probably right now the most important place on earth economically. And I'm not exaggerating that. The amount of capital investment, global capital investment that's occurring in Nashville, Tennessee right now is unbelievable. I mean, you can't really, there's no field of vision in Nashville. There's so many building cranes. So when there's a very low tax or zero tax environment, the rush of capital into that place in the context of otherwise high taxation, otherwise in the globe, otherwise in the environment, is nuts. I mean, Texas and Florida have seen this for years, obviously Nevada. There's no accident that the greatest tech, the captains of the tech revolution, Amazon and Microsoft, are located in the permanently zero income tax state of Washington. Population losers are Michigan, California, Illinois. All that capital is coming to the zero income tax state. So you either go to zero income tax or you become the Rust Belt. That's the fate, and that's what happens. That's the clear history of the states. We have a lot of the states in our book. You have a choice to make. You either go zero or, just boarded up towns. Jared Paulus, your neighbor in Colorado, understands this. He's made it his goal as a Democrat and a former intern of Arthur Laffer's in his office when he was 13. That we have to go to zero, because if we don't go to zero, we will become the Rust Belt. And I'm very happy to see what Arizona's done, but I want to point out that no state has ever repealed their income tax since World War II. The only example with an asterisk is Alaska, because in the 70s, because they got the oil revenue. So I'll believe these states are going to go to zero when they do it. Until then, they'll simply lose capital investment, and all growth in this country will happen in the zero income tax states.
Well, it's a very clear clarion call to states that have income taxes. New Mexico, you may be aware, you may not be, that under Bill Richardson, also a Democrat, when he was governor, New Mexico started at 8.2, a very high income tax rate, and dropped that down to 4.9. It's since crept upward to 5.9 for very high earners. But we have a history in New Mexico in the not too distant past of pretty significant income tax reductions. Now, income tax and capital gains are two different things. Are there preferences within, the Laffer model, or, just generally your way of thinking as to which one is more important, which one makes sense, capital gains taxes or income taxes?
Yeah, let me make one point about New Mexico. And Bill Gates did start Microsoft in
He did.
Albuquerque, but of course he left, and he went to a zero income tax state when the company threatened to get big. Jeff Bezos went to Washington. Jeff Bezos was working in New York when he got the idea to start Amazon for D.E. Shaw. And he immediately got in a car and moved to Washington. So, a 6% income tax is, you might as well just sign your own death warrant. Pennsylvania brags that it has a low income tax rate of 3.07% compared to its neighbors. And, Pennsylvania is just a festival of boarded up towns. So you got to go to zero. Arthur Laffer believes that all income should be treated equally. So there's kind of what the economists call a Haig-Simons definition, which is what is your increase in net worth minus your consumption and gifts. And it doesn't discriminate against capital gains and ordinary income. And he says if the rate is low enough, if it's 10%, you can just treat all income equally. You only have these distinctions in income if rates get high, and then you have to start saying capital gains and ordinary. So if rates are low enough, you can just have everything the same rate.
And let's talk about the United States as a whole. I mean, it seems impossible that we would get back to a zero income tax, and maybe you agree with that, or maybe there's some kind of midway point at which we would be in a position to start that trajectory towards better tax policy in the United States. What would you like to see happen next to the U.S. federal tax code?
Yeah, well, we know if we just look at the episode of the 1980s, or you use 1960s if you want to, or the 20s. So the United States had, we're talking about, we have huge debts now, right? So we had huge debt after World War I. I mean, the United States never had a debt like it had in 1919. And then it ran 11 straight years of surpluses, 1920 through 1930, as it cut tax rates radically. It cut the top rate from 77 progressively down to 25%. So early 20s, rate goes from 73 to 25, 10 straight years of surplus, government debt just annihilated. Great economic growth. Okay, 1960s, you start to have the overhang of World War II debt is still there. Cut tax rates, 5% growth per year, GDP. 1982, stagflation, debt, only 33% of GDP, grows initially in the Reagan years. By 1999, surpluses as far as the eye can see. So we know what we have to do to get fiscally correct. That is have low tax rates, particularly on the highest incomes. There is no extended period, none in American history of like 10, 15 years, in which you have a regimen like that, and you do not have a complete reversal of the federal accounts into something like serious surplus. There's no example. So if right now we cut that top tax rate substantially down to 25% or below, I'm telling you in 2040, we would be wondering where all the federal bonds went, because that's every single case in American history. So if we cut top tax rates, you will just see a surplus of tax revenues, and then we'll have brand new problems about, do we even need tax revenue at all?
I mean, obviously spending needs to come down fairly significantly for tax reduction at some point. And is it something where the spending will drop as the economy grows, or at least as a percentage of the economy? I know there's kind of that mindset that you don't actually have to cut spending. You grow the economy quickly enough and you can kind of swamp the effects of spending. How do you see that dynamic working out?
I mean, we have to ask ourselves, what is government spending? Now, government spending is, of course, just an embarrassment. I mean, that's what it is. But what is government spending? Government spending is two things. It's corralling the private workforce into government employment, number one. So it's government employees. And number two, it is corralling private marketplace activity and profit-making activity into government contracts. So government contracts and government employees, essentially the entirety of government spending, whatever it is now, 5 trillion, I haven't even counted lately, 6 trillion. All right, well, when there's booming economic growth, a lot of people don't like to work for the government anymore because it's much more exciting and rewarding to work for the private sector for most people than it is for the government. People more prefer to work for the government when there are straitened circumstances. So when you have a long-term boom, let's say the 18-year boom from 1982 to 2000, when you had 40 million new jobs, I mean, the private sector just lures people away from government employment. Then second, when that happens, nobody wants government contracts anymore. You know, the easy money of government contracts, you got to fill out the forms and the compliance. Hey, forget that stuff. There's great money to be made in the private sector. So I'm afraid the way to get lower spending in all of federal spending is those two things, government employment and government contracts. The way to get rid of those things is to have a dynamic private economy. And for that, you need low tax rates, particularly on the investor class, which is at the top.
All right. Well, anything else you want to discuss in the last few minutes of the show about the book or about the Laffer Center or any of your work?
Sure, just about the book, would like to emphasize how there's kind of a myth out there that when tax rates were very high, like in the 1950s, there was a golden age of prosperity. We had a lot of fun talking about how people avoided their taxes, and that was essential. And that it's always the case that if you want the rich to pay their fair share, or much more than it, you cut tax rates. You cut tax rates at the top, the rich pick up the entire nation's tax bill, and then everyone else is off for the races.
All right. The book is Taxes Have Consequences, An Income Tax History of the United States, by Arthur Laffer and by Brian Domitrovic, and also Gene Carnes-Sinquefield. So don't want to leave them off the title here. So it's looks like a great read. I know it just came out a few days ago, so it's something to add to your bookshelf and make sure that you find out all about this interesting history. I hope we've scratched the surface there a little bit with this podcast. So thank you very much for spending some time with us today. And thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.